February 9th meeting. We have 2 bill hearings today, and then hopefully we have a little time left over to work some bills. So to start with the first bill hearing, I will open the hearing on House Bill 2574 and ask Natalie to give us an overview.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2574 would establish time limitations for awarding compensation for mental health counseling under the Crime Victims Compensation Board, and it also increases certain compensation award amounts. Section 1 amends KSA 747301. That's the definition section in the Crime Victims Compensation Board statutes. Under current law, in the definition of an allowable expense, funeral expenses are not allowed to exceed $5,000. This bill would change that cap to $7,500. And additionally, crime scene cleanup expenses are not allowed to exceed $1,000 under current law, and this bill would change that to $2,500. The definition of crime scene cleanup is also amended to provide that it may include replacement of materials that were removed because the materials were biohazardous or were damaged as part of evidence collection. And then Section 2 amends KSA 747305. That's the statute that sets out the requirements for the application for compensation. Current law there provides that compensation for mental health counseling can be awarded for an application that was not timely filed to a victim who witnessed a violent crime when they were 16 years of age or younger, if the board finds good cause for the failure to timely file, and that is filed before that person turns 19. Compensation for mental health counseling for victims of sexually violent crimes can be awarded when an application was not timely filed if the board finds good cause for the failure to timely file and either the claim is filed within 10 years of the date of the crime, that's a change that you guys made to the statute last year, or if the victim was less than 18 years of age at the time of the crime, the claim is filed within 10 years of the date that the victim turns 18. This bill would allow the board to award compensation for mental health counseling for an application that was not timely filed to a victim who is or will be required to testify in a sexually violent predator commitment of an offender who victimized that victim, if that claim is filed within 2 years of that testimony being given, and to a victim who was notified that DNA testing of a sexual assault kit or other evidence has revealed a DNA profile of a suspected offender who victimized that victim, again, if the claim is filed within 2 years of that notification. And I can take any questions.
We have questions for Natalie? Do not see any. Thank you, Natalie. We'll begin with proponents. Richard Samaniego is online, I think. There we go.
Good afternoon, Chairman Patton and members of the House Judiciary Committee. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can. Good to see you.
Yes, thank you. Just always like to check. My name is Richard Samaniego. I'm an attorney in Wichita and serve as the chair of the Crime Victims Compensation Board. On behalf of the Crime Victims Compensation Board, I want to thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony in support of HB 2574. For those who may not be familiar with the Crime Victims Compensation Board, the board is composed of a 3-member board with each member appointed by the Attorney General, subject to Senate confirmation. The other current board members are Stuart Height and Becky Dickinson. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention our staff, Executive Director Kristen Chagala, and also the dedicated staff members within the Attorney General's office who are really the ones on the front line helping the victims with their compensation claims. The Crime Victims Compensation Board assists victims of crime in Kansas with compensation for loss of earnings and out-of-pocket medical expenses as a direct result of a violent crime. The board also approves claims to assist victims' families with reimbursement of funeral, burial, cremation expenses, as well as grief therapy. The board meets once a month to review and approve the claims to be paid through the fund, but also to hear requests for reconsideration and hearings for denials pursuant to the Kansas Administrative Procedure Act. One meeting is an open meeting and the other is pursuant to the CAPA. Last fiscal year, the board paid more than $2.5 million to or on behalf of victims of violent crimes. payments for the victims through the state Crime Victims Compensation Fund, as well as the Federal Victims of Crime Act, VOCA, compensation grant matches 75% of every state dollar spent for victims. Both sources are primarily funded through the fines, fees, and penalties throughout the criminal justice system. Those are all put into the pot, and the victim's claim is not dependent on their specific case. The board recently met on August 12th, 2021, and unanimously supported the revisions proposed in HB 2574, which simply increases the statutory limits for certain claims that have not been updated for quite some time. Funeral expenses are allowable expenses, and we would increase those to $7,500. The current limitation of $5,000 was last increased in 1998. As you might imagine, that costs have gone up significantly since then. The majority of funeral bills submitted to the Crime Victims Compensation Board exceed $5,000, with families having to pay any costs above that cap. We're seeing funeral bills averaging about $6,300, and a third of those are exceeding the $7,500 cap that we're requesting in this bill. The legislation also involves the crime scene cleanup definition. Presently, the crime scene cleanup limitation of $1,000 was added in 2007 and has never increased. Recently, crime scene cleanup costs have averaged about $2,500. The crime scene cleanup is an extensive process, but as you might imagine, very necessary for victims and their loved ones who are not experienced in removing biohazardous materials. The process is quite traumatic, especially for the loved ones when there's a murder. The bill also clarifies and broadens the provisions regarding crime scene cleanup expenses to help victims restore their homes after a violent crime. Currently, the statute defines crime scene cleanup as the removal of biohazardous materials, but does not authorize the board to replace them. This has caused confusion and hardship for many victims, as we hear in our board meetings, and the proposed provisions would allow the board to approve claims to replace carpet that must be removed due to its biohazardous materials, or if it was damaged during evidence collection. This is allowable under the federal crime victim compensation requirements if it is allowed by the state statute. Additionally, HB 2574 removes the $100 minimum for crime-related expenses before the board can pay a claim. For some victims, any expense is a hardship, and the board didn't see any reason to keep that $100 minimum on there to prevent assistance. Finally, HB 2574 provides a correction to restore provisions related to the sexual assault kit initiative that we believe were inadvertently removed from the passage of HB 2077 in 2021. These provisions are vital to ensure access to compensation for mental health counseling for victims who are notified that DNA testing of a sexual assault kit has revealed a suspected offender or a victim will be required to testify in a sexually violent predator commitment hearing. These are very stressful events, and putting this provision back would allow the compensation of if the claim is made within 2 years of notification of the DNA testing or within 2 years of testimony. Thanks again for the opportunity to present testimony on this legislation. I respectfully request your favorable recommendation of HB 2574, and I'd be happy to stand for any questions of the committee.
Any questions for Richard? Representative Carmichael. Can't let quiet just go on by.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Usually I would say that my old friend, Mr. Samaniago, came a long ways, and I didn't want him to leave without him knowing that we were paying attention. But let me back up to a couple, 3 things that you've said. In 2021, we did, as you know, make amendments, and I really thought that, in fact, we were extending benefits to people who'd suffered mental trauma in association with sexual assault. And it sounds like we messed up somehow. I don't want to repeat that mistake, and I want to apologize to the people that we left out. Can you just give me a real quick explanation of how it was we messed that deal up?
Absolutely. Thank you, Representative Carmichael. And you're correct. We are thankful for what you approved last session, which did expand the assistance that we can offer, especially for victims of sexual crimes of minors. But the statute, the way it was drafted, had a very convoluted long sentence that was around that section that was modified. And so to simplify it, when they revised the language, a lot of the additional language that I'm referring to with the sexual assault kit initiative was inadvertently taken out. And we weren't able to on time put it back in before it made its way through the process. So I just think it was just a inadvertent mistake that because of the way it was drafted, that sentence was drafted.
Well, ultimately, we as a committee bear the responsibility for that, and I apologize to those that we let down. Mr. Chairman, my second question, there we go, get that thing. So seldom I come to committee, I forgot how to use a microphone. My second question is, of course, I'm concerned about the solvency of the Crime Victims Compensation Fund, and I know that the compensation has been woefully inadequate for many, many years. I'm sure your board, though, has looked at whether or not these changes would impact the solvency of the fund. Could you address that just briefly for us?
Absolutely, Representative Carmichael. In fact, last year, the matching grant was increased from 60% to 75%, which was a much needed jolt to help crime victims.
That's 60 to 75% of the total amount of the damage, or 60 to 75% of what? Help me.
The federal VOCA grant will now match 75% of all state dollars.
Gotcha.
So every state dollar we approve, they match at 75%. So according to the fiscal note by the Attorney General's office, it shouldn't have an impact on the fund by increasing these limits that we've included in the proposed legislation.
And I remain, though, concerned, of course, about the use of docket fees to fund all sorts of things. What is the docket fee presently that goes to the Crime Victims Compensation Fund?
It is not. Yes, thank you, Representative Carmichael. That is a common mistake. It is not necessarily the docket fees, it's the fines and fees and related to the criminal offense. So those are the ones that are actually funding the Crime Victims Compensation Fund, including earnings from prisoners in the Department of Corrections. And so it is not the docket fee, but it's the fine assessed for the crime.
We have much work ahead of us today. If you don't mind, I'll try to give you a call later in the week, and you can fill me in a little more. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Samaniego, my question is on page 4, beginning in lines 9, looks like. There aren't changes to it, but I just wondered if you could provide some clarity for me. So where it talks about the person can file with the division within 2 years of the reporting of the incident to law enforcement if the victim's less than 16 years of age. And then later down, it's within 10 years of the date the victim turns 18. But from what I recall, the civil statute of limitations for child sexual abuse is like 3 years after they turn an adult, and they would have reasonably known that sex abuse had occurred and was the source of the problem. So I'm kind of seeing a mismatch here from what they can apply to the Crime Victims Compensation Board and what statute of limitations right now are for civil cases and child sexual abuse.
Yes, thank you for that, Representative, that question. That was what was passed last year. in the legislation to increase the amount of time for child victims. And the purpose of that extension is a lot of times it takes many, many years from a mental health perspective for people to, for these things to get resolved. And a civil statute of limitations doesn't necessarily address that. And that's why this is specifically focused to mental health. And so during that time period, if there are mental health issues, they can make a claim to access funds to make sure their mental health is taken care of. As you know, that mental health is an extreme public policy issue this day and age. And this is just one piece of helping people that have suffered a violent event to get help.
Thank you. So what I understand, it's they couldn't sue someone on a civil basis to pay for that mental health counseling, but they could apply to the Crime Victims Compensation Board for some reimbursement of those mental health counseling costs.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Richard? Very good. Thanks for being here. Next,
Chair.
Lindsay's back. Lindsay Ford. Get you your own special chair out there.
That would be great. Good afternoon. I'm Lindsay Ford. I'm the public policy attorney with ks.gov. We are, as some of you might remember, a statewide coalition. We have 25 member programs that provide direct services to domestic violence and sexual assault victims across Kansas. We're here today providing proponent testimony on this bill, primarily because mental health counseling is one of the most fundamental aspects for survivors recovering from sexual violence. And any access to mental health counseling is potentially going to make the difference between recovery and ongoing mental health issues as a result of their victimization. Recovery is an ongoing process and can take a significant amount of time. It also varies from survivor to survivor. Everyone processes trauma and experiences crime differently. And certainly new events, new traumatic episodes associated to victimization can definitely set someone back. So we support this bill because it would allow victims access to mental health treatment when they need it, which is going to put them in a better situation to process and deal with their trauma. So with that, I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Any questions? Okay. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Any other proponents? Any neutral? Any opponents? Okay. Close the hearing on 2474. Open the hearing on House Bill 2542 and invite Natalie back up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2542 would create the crime of abuse of a sports official. The bill enacts a new section of law that would provide that abuse of a sports official is intentionally striking, shoving, kicking, spitting on, or otherwise causing physical contact with a sports official or threatening to engage in that conduct, approaching a sports official in a menacing, threatening, irate, or violent manner that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for their safety, or directing, threatening, abusive, or obscene language or making obscene gestures toward a sports official that would cause a reasonable person to fear for that person's safety. Violation of abuse of a sports official would be a Class B person misdemeanor unless that sports official is under 18 years of age, in which case it would be a Class A person misdemeanor. The bill defines a sports official as a person who serves as a referee, umpire, linesman, timekeeper, assistant inspector, or judge, or who performs similar functions as at a competitive event, whether they're paid or unpaid. And I can take any questions.
Questions? Representative Carmichael.
Thank you. Ms. Scott, in listening to the description of the conduct that this statute or proposed statute would prohibit, it occurs to me that all of these actions are probably currently misdemeanors under the law of battery or assault. Is this adding anything to what type of conduct? First, is this adding anything to the type of conduct that we are prohibiting?
So, Mr. Chairman, and when I sit back down, I can read to you what the elements of battery are, but I do believe that specifically with paragraph 1, striking, shoving. I mean, if you're coming into physical contact with someone, that's absolutely going to be at least a simple battery. And then the approaching, that's probably going to fall under assault. Same with directing obscene language at someone's probably going to be assault. But I would have to read you the elements of those offenses for you to decide whether you think those overlap.
Well, my presumption is going to be that all this conduct is already against the law in Kansas. If we accept my premise for a moment, how, if at all, does this statute change the penalties from, as opposed to simple assault, simple battery? How would a battery or assault upon a sports official be punished or handled, just punished differently?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Carmichael, I know off the top of my head that a simple battery is a Class B person misdemeanor. I will have to look at what assault is under the current law. So that would remain the same, except we don't have in battery and assault specific provisions if the person's under 18 years of age. So that could be an enhancement. I'd have to kind of
Yeah, that would be an enhancement from a B to an A misdemeanor, I think, under this bill.
Under this bill, yes. I'd have to, I know that that doesn't specifically exist in battery or assault now, but it could be covered elsewhere. I'd have to look.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions for Natalie? Representative Ralph.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, Natalie, my mind was wandering a bit. In this bill, are we addressing any situation that has a sports official involved? And I'm trying to picture something that's whether school-related or extracurricular or something that's just like these weekend tournaments or whatever. Is that addressed, what that circumstance is? I apologize.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Representative Ralph, if you look at the definition of a sports official, it applies to anyone who is serving those capacities, referee, umpire, et cetera, at a competitive event, whether paid or unpaid. So I think school or extracurricular, it would apply to both situations.
Representative Carmichael.
Thank you. What about the pickup softball game in the backyard behind my house? If I go out there and volunteer to umpire and I make bad calls and somebody comes up and gesticulates in my face, is that covered?
Well, Mr. Chairman, Representative Carmichael, the prosecutor would have to prove that the person was a sports official. I mean, that would be an element of the crime because you have to have a sports official and then that conduct happening. So a trier of fact could make a determination one way.
Certainly. I'm just trying to figure out, though, the definitions within the law. It does sound to me like that if I was officiating the kids' pickup softball game out in the backyard, that I'd be a volunteer and it's a competitive sporting event, and hence I would have the protection of this law. I'm not trying to say whether it's good or bad, but it sounds to me like it would apply to that circumstance as well.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Carmichael, I wouldn't be able to really opine whether a trier of fact would determine that does indeed meet the definition of a competitive event or not. But I mean, certainly those things could be argued during the course of a proceeding related to this.
Thank you for your help.
Any other questions for Natalie? Okay. We'll move on to proponents, and our first proponent is Representative Samsel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Minority Member Carmichael and committee. It's been my pleasure to serve on this committee for 4 years now. As many of you have learned over that time, officiating is something that I've been passionate about. I've done youth, little kids, from the time I was in high school myself all the way up to I still do high school games all over the state of Kansas. It's one of the most fascinating, rewarding jobs working with our youth, getting to work from some of our biggest 6A schools all the way down to our 1A schools. And then also, to Representative Ralph's point, tournaments where we bring in AAU athletes from all over the country to parts of our state, usually in our urban areas, but also way down to our kids and our grandkids, even sometimes in our backyards pickup games, where somebody like I used to, I was one of those silly kids. Sometimes not only would I play, but I'd volunteer to officiate and do some of those things and hone my skills, I guess. But this legislation is before you today because of a growing problem. I think you'll hear from some of the other proponents that we're actually at a breaking point at this point in our state and across the country, which is why 25 other states have already taken similar actions. 22 of those have passed similar legislation, this is patterned after. 3 of those have done resolutions addressing the problem and keeping it in the works. But my real concern is if we don't take action soon in this body, especially at the youth level or some of our sub-varsity games where we don't have usually administrators or other persons on site, that this is a problem that's going to continue to grow. As the ranking minority member did note, there is some overlap between existing Kansas law, assault and battery, but there's also some examples that I've listed for you on page 2. These are examples that assault and battery probably will not cover, and they certainly have not pressed charges. And I would suggest to the committee that if we don't do something about these continually growing and increasing occurrences, that we're not going to have refs to do these games that we all love when we go show up to watch our kids or our grandkids or our community games. If you look down at the bottom of page 1, I've noted just a couple statistics there. Kansas actually going into this year has the lowest number of officials registered at any time since 1989. So our numbers have dwindled. We're down 30% from 2013 to 1,410 right now. We've decreased by 30%. This was a problem before COVID existed. It's exacerbated. And as I think you'll hear from some of our other proponents, the question really is how do we get them back? On page 2, you'll see that spectator behavior is cited often as the #1 reason. And then I won't go through each of these committee, but if you look at those 4 bullet points I've listed for you on page 2, these are all instances that I've personally seen while I've been out either officiating myself or watching others officiate. One of the most common ones is somebody gets upset often at the end of the game. They will come up and they will often push the referee. And you'll ask, well, why don't we just charge them with assault and battery at that point? For any number of reasons, we're awfully told that's not sufficient. And then it turns into he said or she said, well, the ref did this first to provoke it. To me, as an official, it should not matter. It's much like the protections that we enjoy as a legislator. If you come up and push me in some heated conversation or something like that, we provide added protection so that that situation never occurs, and they know in the back of a mind, if they're coming towards a legislator, that that's something that they're potentially going to have to deal with, whether it's an escalated penalty, which this bill does. To the ranking minority member's question earlier, it does increase the penalty to a Class A misdemeanor, if especially out at those youth sporting situations where a lot of our teenagers are first getting started. That's where we've got a lot of young folks first getting started, and we're losing those folks at an early age because of the treatment they're enduring, often from fans, but sometimes from coaches or others too. And then the second example I would give you with that I think this one would address is bullet point number 3. This was one of the most troubling ones I've had. This was a state quarterfinal game we reffed over in the Johnson County area. Great game. Students were into it. The student bodies were huge. The bleachers were full. Very competitive game. Early on, there was a gentleman yelling across the field at the referee, all kinds of provocative language. That would not yet trigger it under this law because that would not put a reasonable person into fear, probably. But as the game continued on, or still in the first half, the gentleman comes across the field and around the fence, still yelling at the referee and earshot of the players and the opposing bench, yelling a lot of that language and the menacing words, the threatening language and other things. So we finally at some point are able to get an administrator over there to help address it. Well, that gentleman then proceeds, as I've noted in my testimony, to change his appearance 3 times over the course of the game because it was cold outside. He changed his jacket, his stocking cap, his hat, any number of other things to avoid detection, all while using the threatening, abusive, obscene language. So we finally get the administrator to address it again. By the end of the game, the administrator escorts the referee off the field, gets him to his car. Well, as soon as the administrator leaves and turns to go work with his student bodies and fans and others on the other side of the field, that gentleman then proceeds to go intercept his car in the parking lot, cut him off, and continued. And I don't know that either of that would qualify as an assault or battery, but it's certainly something that we need addressed. It's not working under the current law. And if this is what it takes, even if it's perhaps a bit duplicative in some areas, I would suggest, and if there's better ideas out there, but if we don't do something, I'm afraid we're not going to have these games that we love across the state of Kansas. So with that committee, as always, I validate your thoughtful discussion, and I stand for questions at the appropriate time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Questions, Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative. Moving to the specific example that you cite of the person who changes his appearance and then cuts off and intercepts people and so on. Number one, I think that's certainly disorderly conduct, wouldn't you agree?
I would hope so. The prosecutor and law enforcement didn't seem too interested in it, though.
You understand that just by us passing a law that increases the penalty for battery or assault upon a juvenile does not necessarily mean that a prosecutor is going to be more or less likely to bring the charge than they are today. You understand that, don't you?
I do understand that, and I also understand, though, that if there's a law specifically protecting a sports official, that individual is probably less likely to conduct any of that action, regardless of which category we put it in.
Mr. Chairman, if I might, I'd like to move to a separate topic. I'm concerned that assault or battery upon children by an adult is apparently only a Class B misdemeanor. Couldn't we protect more children in more settings, whether it's at school or on the schoolyard or at the mall, by instead increasing the penalty for an assault upon a child by an adult to, if not a Class A misdemeanor, perhaps a person felony? Wouldn't that protect more children and accomplish your purpose, since it would not only be kids on the schoolyard, but kids at school?
We would welcome that opportunity, Mr. Ranking Minority Member, but the context that we were specifically trying to address here was the sports officiating community and those officials who are out there, and especially in this environment, a lot of them are working 4, 5, 6 nights a week.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Hoheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative, for bringing this. It's unfortunate that you couldn't find a way to name this after me. I am just curious. I do coach my sons, or have in the past. I haven't been able to lately with being up here. My son's youth baseball team, and occasionally I like to argue balls and strikes because, you know, we don't have robot umpires yet, and quite frankly, we need them because officiating is terrible. The quality of officiating is terrible. Under this, I would, if we passed 2542 in the law, I would still be able to argue balls and strikes with an umpire.
Yeah, you absolutely would. And that's why we put into those second and third subsets there that it would put a reasonable person for fear of their safety. And there's no reasonable argument that somebody would be fearing for that at some point. And I didn't want to get into using any names because we've joked about that and stuff off the record. But no, and to your point, though, our officiating isn't very good in a lot of places right now. And it's actually only getting worse because we're losing our younger officials. And then a lot of the older veterans right now, like myself, are thinking this isn't worth it anymore because we deal with my examples on a regular basis. And so I don't know what it takes in order to help get, whether it's law enforcement or prosecutors or our just community, but just treating each other decency. It's a growing problem.
I agree. It seems that in most cases that involve my kids, my boys, my team, that the officiating is terrible against my team. Anyways, if I want to kick dirt onto an umpire's feet, which occasionally happens, or on the home plate, you know, it happens, would that be considered a threatening gesture, I guess, under this?
I think that would come down to a fact question for law enforcement and the prosecutor, but I suspect the answer would be no. And for the record, I did not officiate any of the representatives or his children's games.
There was one really, it was rough. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Neely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I absolutely agree with you that some of this needs to be done. I've refereed at least 4 different sports for 20-plus years. My dad did it for 40 years. Some of the stories that he told were considerably worse than anything I ever went through. But there is the potential for violence, and I think that's some of what you're talking about too, and everything, is that when these things are happening, they can progress into something that could be potentially violent. When you have somebody that's mad enough to come and chase you off the field and follow you to your car, the potential for violence is obviously there, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so I agree with you on that aspect and everything. I think the thing is a little bit vague for a reasonable person for fear. What I may not fear as opposed to a 16-year-old boy may fear. I don't know how we define that, but that bothers me a little bit. But I completely agree with you in the ability that something needs to be done on this. And I've seen it, I've stopped it. And it continues to occur almost at every game. It seems like you see the people yelling and screaming and using profanity and stuff, and it's sad that we're at a point that this needs to even be brought up. Thank you, sir.
And if I may respond to that briefly, Mr. Chairman, and Natalie may correct me or supplement here, but not to sound like a lawyer, but I think what we tried to do with that reasonable person standard is an objective standard. So if it is a 16-year-old in that situation, what would a 16-year-old objectively find to be threatening, or any of those other subcategories there, versus if it's a 35-year-old, 50-year-old, something like that, what would be objectively reasonable in those situations? So that's what our goal was. And like I said, I'm not wed to this bill necessarily, but I really am concerned if we don't do anything where we're headed right now, because it really is at a tipping point. Mr. Chairman. And it's one of the mantras we use when we officiate, penalize the first offense. If we don't get the first offense, things quickly deteriorate and things get worse fouls, things escalate. And the first offense really is usually coming at the sports official. Yeah, I may not have been very good at my job, but there's other ways to address that with an assigner or try to get others out there rather than approaching usually in a heated environment.
We used to call it making friends.
Yes, sir. The Christmas card list.
Representative O'Hobbison, I see your hand up. This would not apply to poor officiating at the Chiefs games. You're aware of that. You still have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, my good friend, colleague, Representative Sampson. I have a question with respect to this particular bill itself. I know I have to agree with my colleague, Representative Neely, in regards to when things progress, it could be, could lead to something very serious. And that could be something, maybe a spectator yelling at an officiator using slurs, racial slurs or something. So my question to you is will this bill, or if we pass it, how will it address people who actually provoke, using, if you're a minority officiating and they, use slurs at you because you made a bad call. I mean, of course, we know that, some words could actually trigger something whereby a fight could break out just in a second and it'll get into a he said, she said kind of a deal. What can be done in order to address that particular problem in terms of making sure we protect officiatings who are either minorities or women, make sure that even though that sometimes, bad calls are made, yeah, but at least that respect is there. And spectators or people who are just attending the games are mindful and respectful.
Yeah, well, thank you, Representative. I think you just gave a great example of what would fall under subcategory A3 there of using obscene language. And if it puts that person in fear, whether it's a racial slur or something similar, I think that does give a tool to law enforcement and the prosecutor to hopefully address the situation that otherwise wouldn't be there under our assault and battery laws.
Well, you use the word hopeful, to address it, because sometimes some prosecutors may not even do it because it gets into a he said, she said kind of a deal. And of course, some words can be used against minorities, some words can be used against women that, if they're next to you, they could start a fight, so is increasing the penalty, will increasing the penalty help, or will it, do we need to increase the charges that need to be brought if such things happen? That's just my 2 cents on it.
The idea was, especially with somebody who's under the age of 18, by increasing the penalty and hopefully catching more of the conduct, that this would stop at those situations where conduct's often the worst and there's often the fewest people there to do something about it. And to your point, like I can give an example right off the top of my head. It happened last year during COVID, so nobody's in the gym and you can hear everything that's said from one of the parents. I was working with 2 women at a high school game and they made comments about our crew wearing dresses all night long. Was that appropriate? No, it wasn't, but it didn't cause any of us to reasonably fear for our safety either. So this would not, it doesn't get into that realm of perhaps inappropriate conduct, but stuff where hopefully if it causes somebody to be in fear, that's really what's deterring a lot of our folks from officiating. When you have to worry about going to the parking lot and wondering if somebody's going to be waiting there for you, that's not something we want to put ourselves or our kids or our families into.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And to the chairman's point, Mr. Representative Sampson, I wish last week, or 2 weeks ago, you should have officiated that Chiefs game, but oh well, maybe next year. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Sansel. And I agree with you that everywhere this is a problem, and it's anger gone wild. But I think I'm sympathetic to what you say, but I'm also sympathetic that everything you described is covered in another criminal code. Carving out special classifications for people for additional protection becomes problematic. What my community does, whether it be a YMCA game, whether it be a city recreation game, whatever it might be, somebody is in control of that situation who has the authority to tell that person that they are ordered to leave, and if they don't, the police are called and it's called criminal trespass. And they can be ordered by an official in authority or even a police officer that they are never to return to the game again, or it's criminal trespass. And cut the problem off at the place that it's happening, rather than trying to do it somehow in some municipal court where some prosecutor isn't going to file anything. Just an observation, because I recognize it's a serious problem.
Yep. And thank you, Representative. I recognize that there's laws out there too, and there's a number of other solutions. I'm just afraid if we don't do something, a lot of these games aren't going to be taking place anymore. Or at least they'll be officiating their own games or some other solution.
Any additional questions for Representative Sampson? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, body.
Next, we have Braxton Spencer. They'll be much nicer to you, I promise.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Braxton Spencer. I'm the junior class president at Anderson County Junior Senior High School. As a student athlete and a referee, I stand as a proponent to this bill. The past 3 years, this thing sounds weird. The past 3 years of reffing, I've been yelled at. Is that better? Okay. I've been yelled at, I've been touched, verbally assaulted, while even just reffing my 5th and 6th grade basketball games I do every week. I've actually had parents come on the court and push me, as well as poking me or grabbing me in the arm by a lot of coaches, actually. As a student athlete, I see players and coaches yell, touch, and attack referees in many different ways. Even just the amount of refs that are quitting or not returning to reffing is getting out of hand. We can barely get our 5th and 6th grade games to get 2 referees to cover them. Take a breath. Even in the past 2 years, 4 of some of my good friends, student athletes, they just won't ref anymore with the rec that I ref at because they are scared that they're going to get attacked or yelled at or something's going to be done to their vehicles. The way we treat our sports officials is not just hurting the referees' feelings, it's hurting the sports in general, because they need somebody to ref the games, and if this keeps up, there's not going to be a single person to ref. And sadly, most of the good referees are gone. I ask you all to please vote in favor of this bill, and I will stand for questions.
Good, thank you, Braxton. Representative Hoheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Spencer, for being here today, all the way from Wellsville, I believe.
Garnett.
Oh, Garnett, same difference. It's an inside joke with
Mr. Chair, where's the door at?
with Braxton and I. You played sports growing up, correct?
Yes.
Was Representative Samsel ever a referee at one of your events?
I don't believe ever at mine, but at some of my brothers.
Did he blow some calls at those events?
Lost my brother the biggest rivalry game of the year one year,
He
but
did.
yeah.
With Wellsville, by the way, and they don't think they're the same.
Oh,
Yeah, we were playing Wellsville and he cheated for him.
oh, that's quite the accusation. Did you verbally assault Representative Sampson?
I don't think I did, but I know people that did.
Okay. And so you referee as well, correct?
Yes.
Do you blow calls?
Oh, all the time.
Okay.
Not on purpose, but it does happen.
It does happen. No one's perfect. Okay. Got it.
Besides you, obviously, Representative Hosout.
Thank you for recognizing that, Mr. Spencer. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Heiberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, it sounds like there's at least one good referee left. So I'd like to thank you for your testimony from a graduate of Garnett High School.
You did? Thank you.
Any other questions? Representative O'Habisam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to tell the gentleman, yes, you just testified you've blown some calls, but I hope to see you in future at Arrowhead Stadium making some good calls. Thank you, sir.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Braxton.
Thank you.
Next online, we have Danny McDorman.
Can you all hear me?
We can.
Thank you, Chairman. Just on top of my written testimony that I give, you all have in front of you, I just want to give you a number that I left off my written testimony. I gave you a percentage, but to put it all in perspective as far as the numbers wise, and I should have introduced myself. My name is Danny McDorman. I'm the Tri-Valley League Commissioner. My league schools are in Southeast Kansas. I also retired last year after a 20-year career of officiating high school basketball in the state of Kansas. The number I want to give you, in 2012, we had 6,001 total officials in our state. This year in 2022, we have 4,574 officials across the board for all sports. It is a growing number. We're in a crisis. When we assign ball games, you'll hear from another proponent. When we assign ball games, guys, this is getting really out of hand in a hurry. We all know, seen videos of things that have happened. As I stated in my written testimony, if this is passed, this is just another recruiting tool for us as an assigner to use towards recruitment of new officials that, hey, before we couldn't use it. If this is passed, we can use it as, hey, you're protected when you step on the floor, the field, in the gym, and we need you. We need the numbers, because without officials, it's just going to become a glorified recess. And I would hate for that to ever happen in our state. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will take any questions.
Very good. Questions, committee? Looks like you get off easy. Thanks for being here. Next,
you.
well, not listed, we have John Dehan. And John actually Representative Samsel passed out some materials on behalf of John, and we'll get those included in the record.
So I wanted to address the robo-cops or the robo-umpires because they had more ejections in the minor league system because of the robo-umpires, because they would do this and the guys would get mad and yell at them and be ejected. My name's John Dehan. I am the Director of Officials for the EKL, Sunflower, KCAL, Kaw Valley, basically 40 high schools in the Kansas City area. I come as far west as Topeka, Shawnee Heights, and Topeka West. I represent roughly 1,000 baseball umpires and officials. I kind of want to address, you're correct. The laws that we have would protect it if I got punched. What we're trying to start here is a stopgap. I've been pushed. In 1991, the reason I got involved in what I'm doing, I was pushed in a gym. Cops weren't called. Nobody cared. They just showed up, and I wanted the guy addressed. Well, my mother raised a kid that said, if you don't have a better solution, don't say anything at all. So I started offering solutions. This is just a stopgap. We're asking for us to be a special classification, and I realize that's opening up a can of worms. But you guys are special classification. If I came over and pushed you right now, I'd probably be in cuffs, whether we agreed on it or not. My car's been keyed. I've been chased out of schools. Those are things that need to be stopped. And this is a stopgap because it's what it's going to do is identify the repeat offenders. Because if that person has a misdemeanor on their charges, the next time they do it, the prosecutor's going to take a little bit more, and it's going to be on their state record. We have a gentleman right now that he punched a referee, and the police officer showed up, and they wrote the referee a citation for pointing his finger at the fan, and then the fan cold-cocked him, knocked him out. They both had to show up to court. That gentleman never showed up to court to press his charges because he realized after the video was there. What we have is the officers, they just show up and they're trying to put out a fire. The prosecutors are so busy, but by having this stopgap of misdemeanor charges towards the sports official, it'll be a bang, bang, easy thing for them to solve. You pushed me, you spit on me, and no, it's not going to address the backyard because I've watched one of my neighbor kids who I gave a flag and a referee shirt to. He made a call and his older brother didn't like it and they got into a little fight. That's not going to be part of that process. But we're asking for that special class. Is this going to solve the shortage of referees? No. But it's going to be one of the fingers in the dam to help us get started in going back to recruiting officials. Sportsmanship is an absolute horrible thing right now. And that's not going to be addressed by this law. That's not going to be addressed by anything other than, common sense, hopefully. The article that I gave you is from Referee Magazine, and it addresses that COVID is part of the problem for our shortage, but we've been going down for 10 years, and COVID's only been here for 18, 24 months. And so we need to do something, and this is just one of the stopgaps that we can have, and hopefully, if you pass this, people will start to recognize it. We've had 3 fights already in my area, and I know that the KSHA representatives are addressing this on a regular basis. I'm open to questions.
Any questions, committee? Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you mentioned the KSHA is addressing this. In what way are they addressing this?
They're handling the situations that are arising right now. They're not addressing this per se. So we had a fight Tuesday night. That's what they're addressing right now.
And how do they do that?
Well, it depends on whatever occurs. There were suspensions. If you're ejected from a game right now as a coach or a player, the coaches have to pay a $25 sportsmanship fee, and they have to watch a 30-minute sportsmanship classes. The kids have to do the same thing, but there's no cost to it.
And if fan gets involved with
right now, if a fan gets involved and they are ejected for they have a 1-game suspension.
Okay. What about like AAU teams, or I don't know if they're the ones that, the traveling ball teams and so forth?
That just all depends on the tournament directors. When I was scheduling youth leagues and tournaments, I would have a tournament director come to me and say, we can't eject that coach because he hasn't paid his fee yet. So youth league and tournament directors, it's about the money for those guys. They don't care about sportsmanship.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any additional questions? Yep. It's the last list. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other proponents? Okay, we'll move on to neutral conferees. Tim Graham is here today along with 3 teachers. So Tim, come on up.
Good afternoon, Chairman, members of the committee. Thanks for having me here today. I appreciate the opportunity to testify. I'm neutral on House Bill 2542. I appreciate Representative Holheisel's questions. I was feeling pretty ashamed of myself as a coach myself that's going to coach tomorrow. I've got 2 games, and I can tell you I'm going to be a really nice guy after listening to your testimony, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. Kansas NEA fully recognizes the situation that this bill is attempting to address. Again, my dad was an umpire for 10 years. When I was a kid, I watched this play out 20 years ago, 30 years ago, even 40. I'll give away my age a little. So we fully recognize this, and I understand as a youth coach there is a shortage out there. Appreciate what you're trying to address. With that in mind, we don't want to get into the merits of the legal arguments of crimes and punishments. That's for y'all. And given that many, given that many of these events are sponsored by schools, and given that many of us and many people see those as just extensions of the classroom, we feel like we would be remiss to remain silent on the growing crisis that we feel and that is very familiar, that sounds very familiar in listening to your stories of teachers and their safety in the classroom. So we've invited actually two teachers. One was ill this morning, to come here today and share with them their personal knowledge to shed some light on that crisis. And I think you'll find that the stories that they want to share with you are very, very similar to what we've heard from the conferees. And so I will yield right now to Leanne Rogers, USD 233 Olathe.
Thank you. My name is Leanne Rogers, and I am a veteran educator. I'm proud to say that I'm in my 35th year as an educator, mostly in primary grades. First grade is my love. I can share that the concerns raised by the author of this bill do not end at the edge of a mat or a court. They exist in our classrooms every day. Educators in our Kansas schools face escalating student behavior and worry about the safety of their students and their own selves when they go to work every day. As an elementary educator, I have worked, or my colleagues have worked with students who are exhibiting behaviors that create safety concerns in the classroom. Behavior is communication. And when our students are hitting, kicking, toppling furniture, running out of the room or the school building, they're trying to tell us something. When a student is throwing books, they're trying to tell us something. When a student is screaming obscenities or spitting on a classmate or their teacher, they're trying to tell us something. When a student is eating crayons or pencils or paper clips, or when they stab their teacher with a pencil, they're trying to tell us something. Educational theory tells us that we must meet the emotional needs of our students before they can be ready to learn. Many of our students are in distress, which leads to an unpredictable learning environment for all students. With large class sizes, a lack of trauma-informed training, and minimal time to collaborate with our mental health staff, the safety of students and staff is in question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Linda Seek, and I have taught Spanish at Shawnee Mission East for 30 years. And for 17 of those years, I was the girls' basketball game manager. And my responsibility was to care for the visiting team and the officials. I was their host and their official escort. And I must have scared a lot of people off because I kept them safe. I didn't check the parking lots, though. So today I'd like to share concerns of many in my district, Shawnee Mission, regarding physical aggression of students towards other students, teachers, and staff. A longtime friend and colleague in my district, who teaches in my neighborhood elementary school, has been repeatedly shoved, scratched, slapped, punched, kicked, and even smashed in the face by a student in her class this year. Although the physical blows have been painful and have required medical attention at times, far more damaging is the emotional stress she endures every day. She's constantly on edge, trying her best to keep her students safe, while also anticipating the next act of aggression. Her principal has been very supportive, yet he too has often been on the receiving end of this child's violent outbursts. And this is not an isolated situation in one classroom, in one school, or in one district. The safety of students and staff is at risk. We know that students can't learn if they're hungry. Their basic needs must be met. The same is true for teachers, staff, and students who don't feel safe in their classrooms or in their school. Safety is a basic need. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Committee, any questions? Representative Carmichael is not going to pass up the chance to have Tim come up, so Tim.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. By our jocularity, I don't think any of us intend to diminish the importance of what folks are testifying about here today. For many years, I've represented Service Employees International Union members who have the custodial contracts, for example, in Wichita schools, the food service contracts, the paraprofessional contracts. I've represented bus drivers. I've also represented certificated employees, such as the folks we have in this room. Would I be correct in assuming that KNEA, to the extent we can fix these problems that are societal problems through legislation, would also want us to try to fix those problems for the many, many other people whose jobs in the schools are very essential? The custodian, the security guard, the food service people, the bus drivers, the paraprofessionals.
Well, the short answer is yes. You know, our motto is making public schools great for every child, and I think we would extend that to everybody that works in that school, a healthy and safe environment.
I certainly presume that would be the case. Should we also try to afford the same types of protections for the children who go to those schools who are victimized by bullies and assaults and et cetera?
Well, John, or Representative Carmichael, now you're getting me into that area that I wish not to dive into, and that's the debate and discussion on crimes and punishment. However,
sure. But as a general principle, you want everybody to be safe, not just the teacher, not just the custodian, not just the bus driver, but the kids who go there as well.
Absolutely.
And their parents when they come to a sporting event. Absolutely. You want them safe.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Any additional questions? Thank you, and thank you all for coming. Any other neutral conferees? Have any opponents? Okay. Close the hearing on House Bill 2542. Committee, let's see how many bills we can get through. First one is 2496, and we will have Natalie refresh our memory.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2496 would enact the Uniform Family Law Arbitration Act. If you guys have any specific questions, I can take them.
Any questions, committee? Are there any amendments? Is there a motion concerning 2496? Representative Hoheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that we pass out HB 2496 favorably.
Is there a second? Representative Schreiber. Any discussion? Seeing none, back to you, Representative Hoheisel.
I close.
For the motion, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. Motion carries. Affirmative votes wanting to be recorded. Hoheisel, Carmichael, Hobson, and Heiberger. Now, House Bill 2527.
Mr. Chairman, House Bill 2527 would remove the authority of law enforcement officers to deliver a child in need of care to a court services officer, and then it would also prohibit supervision of persons found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect by court services officers as well.
You have any questions for Natalie? Any amendments? Representative Hoheisel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move we pass out HB 2527 favorably.
Is there a second? You can't second your own motion. Representative Owens. Oh, sorry, I looked the wrong way. Owens on the second. Discussion. Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Briefly, when we've seen this legislation or similar legislation previously, I had expressed concern about the authority and autonomy of district court judges and the use of CSOs. However, the testimony presented this year seemed to me to have reached a consensus on this matter, and accordingly, I support this legislation. Thank you.
Any other discussion? Representative Hoheisel, you may close.
Close.
Heard the motion. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. Motion carries. The yes votes are Hoheisel, Carmichael, Heiberger, and O'Habisam. House Bill 2537. Natalie?
Mr. Chairman, House Bill 2537 would require the insurance department to hold a hearing in cases that involve an order under the Kansas Administrative Procedure Act.
Any questions? Any amendments? Is there a motion? Representative Hoheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move we pass out HB 2537 favorable.
Second? Representative Neely. Oh, no, take that back. Representative Keither on the second. Discussion. Seeing any, Representative Hoheisel, you may close.
Close.
Heard the motion. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say no. Motion carries. Affirmative votes, Hoheisel, Carmichael, Heiberger, O'Habisam. Okay, now let's look at 2154. This is one from last year. Just a reminder, as Natalie pulls it up, this is one we passed out of committee. It got below the line. It actually maybe got above the line one day and then passed over. It was really close to getting above the line. And then it got sent back to us to continue possibly working on. So Natalie, remind us what it's about.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2154 would authorize the Department of Education to contract with private vendors to install and operate school bus cameras on school buses. You guys did hear it in this committee. You didn't make any amendments to it. You passed it out of this committee. But then I think it didn't get brought above the line perhaps before the deadline, so it was sent to appropriations, and then it was sent back to you.
Any questions for Natalie? If not, yes, Representative Carmichael.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. My memory is poor. There have been so many versions of this bill over the past 4 years, some late at night, as I recall, we've worked on. Can somebody refresh my memory as to which scheme this one is? Scheme, plan, there's nothing wrong with having a scheme.
So, okay, so this one originally, we heard a presentation from a vendor on this one. They zoomed in and talked through it. And when we heard it in 2019, 2020, that was a concern we had, right? We didn't hear from a vendor. We didn't really know how it was going to work. And so I don't even believe we worked it in committee. And so then in the off session, that company reached out to me along with Dan Murray, I think was at the time representing or lobbying on behalf of that company. And they gave me the presentation. And I'm like, I think it would be good for the committee, not that the state has to select this vendor, but actually hear how it's working somewhere. And so in committee, we heard from that vendor, Carl's Kent, on behalf of, is it USA? USA, the state board, others have been working on behalf of this one. And so that's the version that we have before us now. Representative Hoheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know. I'm unsure how I felt about this last year. So my request would be, could we pass this over and possibly bring it back up next week?
So, okay, so here's kind of what I'm thinking. Let's discuss this for a little bit longer. I see some hands up. I have an amendment, which I want to at least get out there for you to see. And then, yeah, either, well, actually with the next, well, we may not even get to the next two. The next one, we may do that tomorrow. But we'll see where we're at after you all get it, and we can decide tomorrow if we have time, if we want to take it up tomorrow or next week. Gets a little more complicated, as you all know. We've got a lot of stuff, and the bills that we're going to work probably next week are more complicated than the ones we'll work this week. So we'll see where we end up. But I'm not going to make you vote today if we're not ready. Representative Owens.
I was just going to say, Mr. Chairman, that last year I had all of my votes recorded, and I'm just wondering if they could tell me how I voted on this. I mean, just wondering.
Yeah, Yeah, we can find that. I'm sure you were a yes.
I believe that I was. A little bit of sarcasm.
Okay, somebody over here had their hand up. Representative Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now I forgot what I was going to say. Thank you. I just want to make sure, I recall that I liked this bill last year and did not like some of the earlier versions, but I do want to make sure if my recollection is correct. Is this mandatory or permissive on the part of the school bus systems, whether it be school or contract?
I don't believe a school district is required to do this if they do not choose to do so. Is that correct, Natalie?
That's correct. It would just allow the department to enter into, basically they'd be creating procedures for if school districts want to contract with vendors to put those cameras on their school buses.
Thank you.
Totally optional.
Representative Humphries?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Representative Carmichael that it does kind of all go together after a while. And we've heard so much, and all along my position has been, I want to do something that keeps cars from passing school buses illegally. And I don't know that having a camera and tickets, is that really the best? I mean, I think it's the only thing we have right now. Like, I want an arm that goes out. So if someone goes, something happens to their car. No one's invented that yet, as far as I know. But they have invented it. Okay. So I do remember last year we had some really good explanation. And Representative Owens, I do think you voted yes, because we talked about this quite a bit. And I think I voted yes too. It was the best we had heard so far, but I just need to reiterate, I'm still not crazy over dissuading that kind of behavior by just raising the penalties. I think something else needs to be done, and this is the safety of our kids. So that's my 2 cents worth. Thank you.
Representative Long?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Representative Humphries maybe addressed my question. So I'm trying to recall, these videos can be used to prosecute people. Is that correct?
No,
Or
it's.
ticket them.
Yeah, ticket them would be a good example. Kind of like on the turnpike, similar to that. Like if you drive through and you don't stop for the toll, you get the ticket in the mail.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Heisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Reading through this now, just real quick, trying to refresh my memory. Natalie, the local school district contracts with this private company, and the enforcement mechanism or the onus to collect on the ticket is through the private company, if I remember right.
Mr. Chairman, there's a few hoops that has to go through, and that part of that would be addressed by your
Let's get to Fred's, or Mr. Chairman, let's get to your amendment and then.
Okay, first, and we don't normally do this when working a bill, but Jim, you want to come up and talk to us about how this amendment that I'm about to offer and how we got to this point?
This is kind of like Groundhog Day, deja vu over again. When I presented it as a representative, that was when we there were issues. And then last year we got the vendor in. Okay, there's a vendor will put on 7 cameras on a bus. And probably the biggest concern that we had last year was the KSDE would be, because, well, let me back up. When there's a violation take place, the camera sends something up to the cloud. The vendor reviews it and says, okay, we have a problem. They send it to Kansas to be reviewed. Last year in the bill, we had it that KSD, Kansas State Department of Education, would be the reviewer. That was a concern of many of you in this committee, as some of the others I've talked to. We have met with the superintendent of the Kansas Highway Patrol, and he is willing to make the changes that Natalie will talk about in the amendment, to have a, I won't call it license, but at least a former police person review these tapes to, not to put it onto just a regular Joe like you or I. So that was, and that was where we had some conversation and some frustration. So Representative Humphreys, I understand your concern, but you know, this has been like, what, we've been at it for 5 years. But the bottom line is, it's what's best for kids and the safety for kids. And a lot of this will take place in states that it's done in. It's done in about 20 states right now. States where it's done in, it's a process of education. And as Representative Humphreys talked about, you know, we don't want to see kids in danger by crazy people driving around buses. The State Department of Education each year puts out a survey one day of bus drivers. And last year, about 230 some of the 286 school districts participated. In one day, there was over 1,000 violations in the state of Kansas. So it's scary, you know, what our kids are dealing with. So I will sit down.
Mr. Chairman, I have my hand up.
I don't even see you anymore. There we go.
Anymore.
Representative Geether.
I'm sorry. Before we get into your amendment, Mr. Chair, I've had a problem with this issue for 5 years. I'm with Representative Humphreys in that, and we just heard the sheer number of violations, but what does it fix? What does it fix by having the camera take the picture and you get a ticket and you have a violation? What does it fix?
Can I address that, Mr. Chair?
Go ahead.
What the vendor states is where this happens, it's an education process because the word gets out, don't mess with the school buses when they're stopped. And it has really cut down on violations. Now that's what we're told from the states that take place.
Representative Hoheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one quick question for Natalie. I'm skimming through here as fast as I can. The images stored, are we mandating how long they can be stored before they're destroyed?
Yes, we do. Let me find that exact.
I think, okay, actually, hold on.
Okay, so if you go to page 4 of, well, you might not have the bill in front of you, but
I got it.
page 4, starting at line 6, that's subsection D is where we
So we're
talk about the
28 days.
Mhm,
I'm saying. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Natalie.
Okay, why don't we have Natalie get the amendment to Kathy? No? Yes, so there'll be 2 amendments coming, one technical. Yes, you can do that as well. So you're going to get the original bill brief that Natalie would have had attached to this bill when we originally heard it last year. You're going to get a technical amendment, and then you're going to get the amendment that deals with switching it, the reviewing agency from the Department of Education to the Highway Patrol. Okay, it showed up in my email. So looking at the technical amendment, you'll see that Natalie simply changed references in years. So moving everything a year forward from the dates that were in the bill as approved last year. That's in the technical amendment. In the amendment that she has labeled KHP, you will see on page 2, there's a 3 references that change from the Department of Education to the Highway Patrol. So again, the vendor, whoever that may happen to be, they will send the alleged violations to the Highway Patrol, and then an official designated under the supervision of the Highway Patrol will review them, and then once reviewed, that person at the Highway Patrol will verify whether what the vendor saw was a violation or not. They'll confirm that. So that's the process. Instead of the State Department being the one that gets the video to review, it will be the Highway Patrol. Yes, Representative Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am presuming there's one step further, that if this independent person with the Highway Patrol reviews it and finds a violation, there is a referral to the appropriate prosecutor?
No, again, so there is no prosecutor involved in this. It goes back, I think, back to the vendor who then issues the ticket. Where does the ticket come from? Okay, hold on. Let Natalie explain what happens before we all try to remember.
And this, if you look at page 2, starting at line 34, and part of this gets into that file is then forwarded back to the Department of Education, who does technically issue the ticket, but they are allowed to contract for those services, which I believe you heard last year in testimony that sometimes that's part of the package deal for issuing the citations. They're not crimes. It's a civil penalty.
Representative Wheeler.
Okay, I just heard the civil penalty. So it's a civil proceeding or an administrative proceeding? Which is it under the department?
Mr. Chairman, it's not, I guess, necessarily technically like a proceeding. You would get a ticket in the mail. So, you pass the school bus camera, the camera detects you, and then that file, all that information is forwarded on to the Department of Education, who now is going to have that reviewed by someone from the Kansas Highway Patrol. But then once that is determined to have been a violation, it goes back to the Department of Education, who then issues a ticket. Now, that does not preclude, if a law enforcement officer does see a violation of KSA 81556, then they would be able to issue a ticket just like they do now.
What I'm concerned about, and I need to make it clear, the ability of somebody who is not a recognized prosecutor in the state of Kansas, either state, municipal, or some sort of, is actually administering punishment to people, and that's the part that I'm concerned about.
And just to reiterate, it's not criminal punishment. It would just be like a ticket, very similar, as the chairman indicated, to how the Turnpike Authority issues a ticket.
Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm not sure if the revisor is the right person or if we have a proponent now of this new bill, but at any rate, the Kansas Department of Education or its designee, a commercial vendor, writes a ticket. How do they even know who to write the ticket to? That's my first question.
Yes, one of the 7 cameras or more that captures not the vehicle, the driver, and the license.
Right, but still, how does that identify whether it was me or my brother or somebody else driving the car?
So that was part of the issue that we discussed last year, and let me find, Natalie, do you recall? I believe it goes to the registered owner, does not matter who the driver is. Is that correct?
That's right. It was a status offense. The status of owning the vehicle somehow makes you guilty. Then my second question is, there's got to be due process somewhere. So if the State Department of Education writes me a ticket, do I go through the Kansas Administrative Procedures Act? In other words, a full Kansas Administrative Procedures Act hearing with a hearing officer to contest this ticket, or do I do that with the commercial vendor who actually wrote the ticket in Chicago and sent it to me?
So that's all outlined at the bottom of 3 and top of 4. So you're correct. It does go through the administrative hearing process. Yeah, on an appeal. If
I don't even get a hearing initially, it's all done behind my back. One day, here comes a ticket in the mail.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, and I never liked the way the turnpike worked either, and I've actually had now to contest some of their citations, believe it or not. Yeah.
Representative Heiberger.
They dismissed it because they were persuaded they had the wrong tag number and the picture of somebody else.
Thank you, Mr. I found the minutes of the meeting. I could state the recorded votes if you'd like.
Okay.
February 23rd, 2021. Yes votes, Owens, Hoheisel, Neely, Heiberger. No, O'Habison, and Carmichael.
Representative Hoheisel, did you have a question?
I have
Comment?
a few questions, actually. I just keep getting more and more. The ranking member asked one of them as far as who we're retaining responsibility to, and to the car, which I'm not comfortable with. One question in this, just because I'm trying to rehash who was proponents last year, and I see Mr. Clump in the back where you guys were proponents. Thank you. Damn, what was my other question? Oh, yes. And this could be for the proponent here. Does the private vendor get any cut of the amount of the ticket written? Do they get a certain percentage?
The approximate amount of the ticket, as we discussed last year, would be approximately $250. The portion that would be retained in Kansas would be the administrative cost, and the remainder would go to the vendor in order to pay for the cameras.
So, yeah, so just so I understand this right, the vendor would be monetarily enticed, I guess, to write as many tickets as possible.
I would just have to disagree to the point that when there's a violation, it goes into the cloud. They send that. They don't write the tickets. They send that to Kansas to have it reviewed, and if there's a violation determined, that's what's determined. The vendor is not incentivized.
They have a monetary incentive to not write as many tickets, so they're not writing the tickets, but to bust basically as many of these as humanly possible, which is a great thing. I don't want anybody running a school bus. My kids ride the school bus. So, how much was the administrative fees? Was that ever said? I'm just wondering how much of that 250.
I would say, and don't quote me on the exact amount, but I would say probably 75% would go to the vendor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you recall, they were providing the technology and that kind of stuff.
You know, and the 7 cameras and the cloud and all that.
Yeah. I guess I'm trying to just pull apart that it's not a base contract with a base amount of money.
Right.
It's you write 1,000 tickets today, you're going to get 75% of that profit. Okay, yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So, okay, before we run out of time, and we will keep discussing this maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, I do encourage you all to if you just go to the legislature's website, click on House Bill 2154, right above it, you can click on testimony, and it's all right there. So you can see who the proponents were, the presentation from Bus Patrol is there. Review all of that. Feel free to reach out. Jim's willing to, Jim,
be happy to.
Want to announce your cell phone number for the public?
I'll be happy to, but, and Mr. Clump is here. He would be happy to address it as well.
So work through your concerns. We'll have plenty of more time for questions and discussion. Representative Carmichael, do you have something?
Yeah, just quickly, perhaps on sidebar, as we would say, I said the Kansas Turnpike Authority had written me the ticket. That's not right. It was our good friends in Oklahoma. And they were very accommodating eventually and tore it up or did whatever they do with these photo citations.
Representative Owens.
Thank you. I'll reserve most of my comments for the next time we discuss this because it all starting to come back to me. But it is worth noting that your amendment appears to take it out of the control of the Department of Ed and put it into the control of the Kansas Highway Patrol, which was a topic earlier.
Not everything, but the review process.
Right, exactly.
The reviewing of the video.
Mm-hmm.
does take place with the Highway Patrol.
Right,
Yes.
exactly.
Okay, last thing for now, Representative Hoheisel.
Thanks, Chair. This isn't in response to that. I just wanted on record that Representative Kincannon's phone did go off during committee today, so. Yes.
Okay, committee.
Justice, Mr. Chair.
So tomorrow, we have one bill hearing, and then add to your list. Okay, so still on the list is 2154, which is the bus bill, 102, and then add 2508, which is the KBI fingerprinting bill, and 2574, which is the Crime Victims Compensation Board bill we heard today. Not sure we'll get to them. Those seem like some that we might be able to knock out relatively quickly, possibly. We'll see. So that's where we're at. See you tomorrow, everybody. Have a good evening. We're adjourned.